Hello, everyone. Welcome back for those of you who have been watching Rocky Watch, and welcome to all of you who have just joined us today. So it's my pleasure today to introduce Herschel Nachlis. He's a research assistant professor in the government department and also a policy fellow at the Rockefeller Center. He studies and teaches American politics and public law, focusing on institutions, health, and social policy. Previously, he was an assistant professor of government at Franklin and Marshall College and a postdoctoral fellow at Dartmouth College. So he's received his PhD and MA in politics and social policy from Princeton University. And it is really my pleasure to introduce him today. I have known Herschel for a few years and worked on several projects with him, and it is always such a thoughtful experience. He's thought-provoking, he is reflective, and he asks the questions and the right questions at the right moment. Please join me in welcoming Herschel.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Sadhna and Joanne. I'm going to briefly get my slides up here so you can all see them. Okay. So I hope you and everyone had enjoyable Memorial Day weekends. And it's great to see you here and to take part in Rocky Watch, a series that's happily created some sense of community and intellectual engagement, even in these bizarre times. So I'm Herschel Nachlis. I'm a professor in the Rockefeller Center and the Government Department at Dartmouth, and I study and teach American politics and public policy, as Sadhna said, focusing on health and social policy. Now, broadly, I'm interested in how old policies and old governance patterns interact with new social problems and new political problems. To today's subject, then, at least as I see it, the crisis response and its consequences are less products of the current president and more products of long-standing policies and governance patterns. Policies and patterns that then interact with the new crisis. So we should think more about long-standing policies and patterns, I'd argue, and think less about Donald Trump. So since many of us have been watching Top Chef lately, a cooking analogy comes to mind. Inherited policies, institutions, and pattern of governance supply the crisis governance menu, and the president supplies the cooking and the seasoning. So policy history puts steak on the menu, and the president, perhaps in this case, seasons it with some ketchup. Now, more to the point, let's think about our crisis public health response. One thing I'll argue today is that America's policy history set us up for a lackluster public health response. The president might have cooked it in partisanship and seasoned it with some undermining of expertise, but a lackluster public health response was simply and regrettably baked in at the outset. And so as a matter of interpretation, prediction, and prevention, I would argue that we should spend more time thinking about these deeper structural issues and less time on Trump. So here's the argument and the talk outline. I want to try to answer two broad questions. First, how did we get here? Second, where are we going? That is, why does the government's crisis response look the way that it does? And how will the government's crisis response affect future policymaking and politics? Can we interpret the present and make predictions about the future? With respect to how we got here, I'll make two arguments, one about the public health response, one about the economic response. So to the lackluster public health response, if we think about American policy history and the fact that the public health response is lackluster, it should not surprise us. Now, I'll elaborate on this in a moment, but in general, the theme of the slide here, this is Ronald Reagan speaking for the AMA in 1961. This is an LP that you can buy online. I believe there's currently one for sale in the entire United States. So snap it up quickly if you want it. This sort of theme, I think, resonates throughout the history of American public health, and it has constrained our public health capacity. Policies stick around when the crisis goes away, and crisis responses durably change and durably expand government. So on where we're going, the policy response might be bad for incumbent politicians and parties, and it might also expand and reshape the contours of the American state with policies that stick around after the crisis. Okay, so to the first main question, why a lackluster public health response? Why was it so slow? Why was it so patchwork? Why is it so fragmented, small, controversial, and incomplete? And the answer that I see is that this is what our policy history is set up for. Our prior health policy choices and governance patterns have constrained our present response, and our present response is layered atop these prior policy choices. So here's what I mean by that. First, ideology. We clearly have a strong libertarian streak in this country. Perhaps it's most pronounced in our being the only advanced industrialized country without near universal health coverage. And again, as the Reagan AMA record attests, fears of socialized medicine resonate. This constrains expansion of the government's health provision. It's in part why the Affordable Care Act didn't even include a public option. Ideology constrains public health expansion. The second, complexity. We have a remarkably complex healthcare system. We have public and private payers, public and private providers, public and private data collection. We have state and federal players, state and federal providers, state and federal data collection. And as the presidential realization on this slide attests, healthcare here is indeed remarkably complicated. And this complexity has profound implications. It's hard to quickly collect reliable and valid national data. It's hard to quickly coordinate evolving standards of care. And differential levels of local capacity make any common approach, even conditional on consensus best practices, difficult. Differential levels of local access, stratified by factors like income and wealth, race, and region, hinder coordination and consistency. And police powers over health and well-being are constitutionally largely left to the states, inhibiting national coordination. Third, we have diminished public health capacity. Since some large-scale federal funding for the expansion of public hospitals and community health centers in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, we have underinvested in our public health capacity. Consider the following. In 1970, we had 718 public hospitals, 718. In 2010, that number stood at 426. Likewise, state and local governments have cut labs that do testing, cut local medical examiners that do coding, basically because when budgets are tight, it's easier to fund police officers than it is health lab technicians. But at a federal level, far more importantly, I think, we have simply prioritized one thing over another. We've prioritized disease research over funding public health capacity. We've prioritized the NIH over the CDC. Now consider each side of the attached graph. On the disease research front, think about highly mobilized, sympathetic advocates arguing for federal dollars to be distributed to research centers like Dartmouth throughout the country. This is an easy sell for Congress. But on the other side, consider that there are not really any large sympathetic lobbying groups arguing for the production and storage of ventilators and vaccines sort of for some indefinite period of time until we happen to need them. Now, of course, private demand-driven as-needed supply chains will under-provide long-term investment in infrastructure and public goods. And these are precisely the kinds of things that only government can really provide at scale, but it has not given these policy choices. And this diminished federal public goods provision yields predictable state-level responses. First, states are forced to bid against one another in the private market for scarce resources. And this is highly inefficient from a social welfare perspective, and is highly inequitable. And second, in the absence of government public goods provision, private actors are called upon to solve public problems. So whether this is the alums in the attached slide, whether it's the mask guy running around the Upper Valley giving out PPE, whether it's my mother-in-law sewing masks and sending them to DHMC, or whether it's Bob Kraft sending the Patriots plane to China and coming back with 1 million masks, because of the underinvestment in public goods provision by public health agencies, these are now being provided by private actors. Now, it's worth noting that, of course, all of this has also been seasoned by the current president and administration with some partisanship and some undermining of experts. Now, public health programs like mask wearing and social distancing have become partisan issues. The Defense Production Act has been used for beef, not ventilators. Public health resources like PPE and ventilators are differentially distributed to politically aligned and electorally convenient swing states. We've disbanded an NSC pandemic response team and sidelined and in many ways muzzled and politicized the CDC. But to be candid, I'm not sure this should really surprise us if we consider the history. Public health programs often fragment along partisan lines. Consider the recent polarized adoption of the ACA Medicaid expansion. A bunch of blue states took it, a bunch of red states didn't. Or consider that Republican and Democrats in individual level data signed up for Obamacare at different rates based on their individual partisanship. Again, these sorts of things shouldn't really surprise us. What's most unusual and worrying, though, I think, is the sidelining and undermining of experts. Again, though, to an extent, expertise is often politicized. Consider on one side the Iraq War intelligence estimates and the clear politicization of those. Or on the other side, consider the ACA, the tortured writing of that law, and the associated scoring of it by the CVO, and the clear political origins of that. Overall, then, I'd argue that our public health response was predictably constrained by history, via a history of fears of government healthcare, a history of complexity born of public and private and state and federal systems, and a history of deprioritizing public health programs and public health goods provision. Likewise, our health response has been predictably affected by partisanship, and less predictably, though not entirely surprisingly, the sidelining and diminishment of expertise. I think, though, that there are at least 3 reasons to be hopeful on this front. The first is that at the state level, over the medium term, as any Policy 5 student will tell us, we often witness policy diffusion, policy learning, and convergence. So with Obamacare, originally only blue states took the expansion, purple states sat it out. But Obamacare is a pretty good policy, it mostly works. And so over time, purple states come to see that and came to adopt common sense health policy measures and take the policy. We see that here. 2/3 of states, well over 2/3 of states have now taken the expansion. 2 other reasons for optimism. At the federal level, there are some efforts to fix some of these problems. So Operation Warp Speed is trying to use the resources of government to speed up private vaccine development. The FDA is expediting, still with its rigorous standards, many forms of test and review. And frankly, third, we all now know that this is a problem and one that we need to fix. Okay, so to the second question, why a decent economic response? And by decent, to be clear, I mean something pretty fast, pretty large, and pretty sensible as far as it goes. I don't mean perfect by any means. The economic response has clear problems, and I'll return to this point, but it's pretty good. And so again, I think our history of crisis economic responses simply set us up for this. It's basically a 3-step dance. First, in the Great Depression, we basically got a bunch of things very, very wrong. So in the Great Recession and the financial crisis a decade ago, we learned from some of these early mistakes and developed a new playbook that worked pretty well. Again, far from perfectly, but it worked pretty well. And third, in response to the present crisis, we pulled the Great Recession playbook off the table, dusted it off, and adapted it for present use. So again, just briefly, in the Depression response, we sort of initially failed miserably. Raised interest rates, didn't act quickly as a lender of last resort, didn't quickly provide credit and liquidity, didn't durably expand the monetary base, did all sorts of things, helped durably crater the US and global economies, not very good. Now, it's worth noting that after that, we did some things well, some large-scale public work programs and public employment programs of the New Deal, and these are the sorts of things we might want to keep in mind moving forward. So I'll return to that later. Now, in response to the Great Recession, and I apologize, this is the busiest and least intelligible slide of this presentation. But after some delay, some confusion, disagreement, we showed that we had learned a lot from our mistakes. The government lent freely against good credit to solvent firms. It injected liquidity into the financial system. It prevented a fire sale of assets. It recapitalized institutions. It expanded the monetary base. It provided fiscal stimulus to workers and states, and it expanded food assistance and unemployment insurance to workers. And this episode of crisis governance relied in large measure on Section 13(3) of the Federal Reserve Act, which at the time was used in a controversial and innovative way as never before. Now, was it perfect? Of course not. Stimulus was probably too small. Some conditions of the bailouts were probably too limited. The effects on inequality were problematic. But it stayed off another depression. And so I'd argue that this recent policy history simply set a predictable stage for the present response. We basically just pulled the playbook off and did it all over again. We reused 13.3. We've established and reestablished another alphabet soup. We've provided some direct stimulus to workers. We've kept credit flowing to businesses and to some consumers. We've extended unemployment benefits. And we've updated some of these measures for the time. So it's worth noting that The airline bailout funds, for example. These are being used to retain and pay employees. They're being precluded from share buybacks. These reforms reflect lessons learned from the populist responses to the last crisis. And executive branch officials have been given something last time's crisis fighters didn't get, but wanted, which is some greater discretion, some greater ability to use their expertise, somewhat more insulated from the democratic branches of government. Now, of course, this largely predictable path is not without its partisan or administration-specific components. So the small SBA is fighting to get back funding went to Planned Parenthood. Predictable. The Fed has authorized the unprecedented buying of junk bonds. Less predictable, a bit bizarre. But again, if we think about the composition of the White House, if we think about people like Secretary Mnuchin, Jared Kushner, and the president and the industries they were involved in that heavily use such debt instruments, maybe less surprising. What again, might be more surprising and worrying is that oversight has been curtailed. So people like inspectors generals, like Glenn Fine, who resigned yesterday, have been removed from much of their power. Now, a final sort of sadly predictable component of this economic crisis and its response is its interaction with inequality. American economic and health crises and their responses typically disproportionately hurt the most vulnerable. We saw this in Hurricane Katrina. We saw this in the Great Recession. We've seen this in the ongoing opioid crisis, and it's no different this time. In the crisis or the response, this has disproportionately hit those with low incomes and wealth, precarious work, racial and ethnic minorities, and women. So overall then, both the partisanship and the inequality exacerbation of the crisis response, while both deeply regrettable, unfortunately shouldn't surprise us if we consider sort of the prior history of America's policy responses to crises. But nor should the sort of pretty good economic response. Again, while we failed in the Depression, we created a new playbook, we dusted it off, and we've adapted it for our present crisis. And moving forward, particularly if there's a Democratic administration after this election, we might dust off more old policies from the New Deal, like large-scale public works and public employment programs that a lot of people are now advocating for, if the economy doesn't recover terribly quickly. Okay, briefly, I want to make sort of two final points with respect to where we're going. First, how the present policy response might affect future elections, and second, how the present policy response might affect future public policy. So in the case of electoral implications, it's safe to say that crises are not great for incumbent parties. So first, there's just extensive evidence in political science to support this. Historically, think back to Jimmy Carter, Iran-Contra, fuel shortages and gas lines, and his 1980 loss to Ronald Reagan, in which he carried only 6 states and the District of Columbia. Or more recently, recall the 2008 campaign. As the financial crisis got worse, McCain's prospects dropped, Obama's prospects rose. And in the scholarship on unemployment and economic shocks, there's some debate about contextual versus individual effects and attitudinal versus behavioral effects, but recent papers seem to converge and suggest that at minimum, higher unemployment hurts Republican candidates and helps Democratic candidates. And there's also some evidence that local experience of crisis-related deaths matter for elections. So for example, there's work showing that having more Iraq War troop casualties from a state substantially decreased support for George W. Bush in 2004. So while there are some rally around the flag effects of war itself, the localized experience of crisis-related deaths clearly has the opposite effect and hurts incumbent parties. Now, there's also the famous finding from Chris Ake and Larry Bartels, among others, about second and third quarter GDP growth and presidential election results. So what this shows is basically second and third quarter of election year, GDP growth tends to be highly predictive of an incumbent's vote share. If incomes grow in the second and third quarter before elections, incumbents do well. If not, they do poorly. Now, there's a ton of debate about this, but if we buy the story, the present circumstances are actually a little bit hard to interpret. So second quarter GDP growth is obviously going to be highly negative. But that means that third quarter GDP growth in a relative sense is almost certainly going to be highly positive, right? If we drop a ton and we increase even a bit, it's a big increase. But the absolute level that we'll be at in the third quarter is obviously far below where we were, say, in the first quarter or the fourth quarter last year. So it's sort of unclear how this is going to work out. And frankly, the president's approval ratings sort of 5 months ago, conditional on a low unemployment rate, were by historical standards extraordinarily low, right? If unemployment was 4%, the president's approval should have been much higher, which begs the question of why. It suggests two responses. One is that people don't really love the president, right? So his approval was low even during a good economy because people don't really like him. The second is that as a measure of good economy, the unemployment rate is no longer sort of as predictive as it used to be, maybe due to labor force participation attrition, maybe due to sort of unequally distributed economic returns. But in either case, even in a good economy, the president was performing poorly. So in a bad economy, you know, the prediction should suggest that that'll get worse. Okay, last point I want to make is about policy implications. So straightforwardly, crises create new policies and policy demands. Crises expand government. The classic book on this is called Crisis and Leviathan from Robert Higgs. Crises durably change and grow the American state. Think back to the New Deal. Think back to 9/11. Think back to the Great Recession. Crises expand government. Now, a second related point to make is that policies are sticky. Once a policy is passed, if it's successful, people want to keep it and expand it. And so even an unsuccessful policy is hard to get rid of because policies create feedback effects. They create new supportive constituencies, new public and private expectations, a new web of related policies. And so if we think about Obamacare, contrary to popular belief, Obamacare is alive and pretty healthy. If you look at the data, Obamacare is doing much better than you might think. And its popularity actually increased after the president took over and after the president and Paul Ryan tried to kill it and failed. People liked it more after the president tried to get rid of it, raised its salience, reminded them of its existence, reminded them they liked it, and they didn't want it to go away. But policies aren't just sticky and hard to kill. They typically ratchet and expand, right? It's not just that they get passed here and they stay here. Once a policy is passed, it typically grows. So Social Security began small in the wake of depression. It has expanded dramatically over time, and it's now among the most durable components of the American state. The second that anyone threatens Social Security, 40 million AARP members kick into gear and save it. And think about the wake of 9/11. A series of new policy arose, intelligence collection programs, drone programs, Guantanamo Bay. And many of these policies have stuck around, continued, and expanded from Presidents Bush to Obama to Trump. Indeed, Guantanamo Bay is still open to this very day. So a few quick implications follow from the present crisis. And I think this is really important. In general, it strikes me that the present crisis, combined with liberal energies of the last few years, are perhaps ushering in a new era of big government. So this should make liberals really happy, should make conservatives a little worried, but it strikes me that this, as an empirical matter, this is quite right. So here are 7 very, very quick predictions, and then I look forward to the Q&A. So first, it's clear that debt concerns matter less now than they did before to policymakers, and that swift monetary and fiscal stimulus are the new rules of the game. Second, present crisis will probably increase demands for larger and more consistent automatic stabilizers like unemployment insurance and SNAP. Third, the short-term gender inequalities that come out of this crisis will, in the medium term, I think, increase demands for gender equality and hasten the adoption of things like paid family leave. Fourth, and more generally, the unequal crisis burdens will increase demands to address issues of inequality more generally coming out of it. Fifth, our public health failure will, in the medium term, give increased attentiveness and resources to these areas, picking up some much needed slack. Sixth, if the economic crisis persists, and if Democrats retake the government, demands for greater fiscal stimulus, perhaps through New Deal style public works and public employment programs, public infrastructure, public health, these will grow. Seventh, of course, if all this stuff happens, or if some of this stuff happens, frankly, even if it doesn't, the government will need to raise more revenue to pay for all of this. And so this will just add momentum to growing movements to increase income and wealth taxes. So I think that the big era of big government is back if it ever went away to begin with. And again, liberals, this is great. Conservatives, this is less great. Okay, so before turning this over to Q&A, I promised my students I would do this, so I'll take 30 seconds to do this. I want to step back and end this on a very Dartmouth note. And it's this. There will be more crises. There are always more crises. And hopefully, we can get better at addressing them over time. And so over the last few terms, I've seen my students wrestle with all these issues, and I've seen them get it right. This past fall, 13 brilliant Rocky seniors and I studied the last financial crisis in the US and Eurozone. We spoke with policy leaders here, and then in December, we traveled to Europe for 2 weeks, and we met with experts in Greece and Germany and Switzerland. This term, I've seen 73 students in Rocky and government classes, week in and week out, identify the durable features and durable patterns of American governance. And then, only then, connect these to our highly unusual present moment, always with impressive wisdom. So history will put future crises on the agenda. There will be errors, there will be setbacks, but I think we'll keep getting better at all of this. And so on that note, at least, all the students from this term, there they are. On that note, at least, I'll turn it back over to Joanne, and I'll look forward to your questions.
We've got a couple of questions to get you started, Professor Nachlis, and I'm hoping that more people will join in. But Daniel is looking for your opinion. He says, a cynical view could be that the powers that be realize the poor and disadvantaged are worse hit and happy that is the case. The response, more lack thereof, may increase that disadvantage. What do you think?
Yeah, that's deeply cynical and not without evidence. I guess what I'd say is that cynicism like that might make sense on the margin, but my hope would be that sort of in the medium term, and once we're no longer talking about the margin, but once we're talking about hundreds of thousands of people, millions of people as we are now, that hopefully considerations like that fall away. I mean, and we've also seen, so response one, on the margin, the cynicism is persuasive, but hopefully in the larger view of things, that's not how it works. But if you buy the cynicism, we've seen how that goes. So consider the populist responses on the left and the right to people feeling marginalized in the last crisis. Right? Out of the last crisis, we see the emergence of both the Tea Party and Occupy Wall Street. So response one is maybe don't buy the cynicism. Response two is that I think people realize now that that's actually a failing political strategy. Because neither the centrist Democrats who run the party or the centrist Republicans who run the party enjoyed those populist movements on their far right and far left, I think. Yeah, it's a good question, and I hope it doesn't play out that way.
Me too. Liz Ann would like to ask you, can you speak to the paradox that in crises, centralized power can emerge as a way to provide structure for better or worse, versus the flowering of lots of leaders to diversify the chances that good ideas will emerge? And that the diversified, non-centralized efforts can create healthy policies and discoveries, as we see in New York State, and can also dangerous chaos, as we see in states denying scientific evidence about needed public policy. And as climate change worsens, will we be seeing what you describe on steroids?
I think the key intuition of this question is precisely the right one about how American government should work under ideal circumstances. So there are certain things that, right, it's a matter of a division of institutional labor across organs of government. The federal government is far better adapted to do certain things than states and local governments. So I think the ideal model, to answer your question, is like the federal government is the only sort of player that can marshal resources at scale and at speed. But states, localities, public and private entities at a more local level are the only ones with the capacity, the incentive, the sort of bandwidth to experiment in precisely the way you've described. So the ideal system sort of leverages these institutional complementarities and the I think the division of labor ideally leverages the best parts of both types of bodies. The federal government provides resources at scale and at speed. And then you see this experimentation work at a local level. And so, I mean, if you want to apply this to climate change, certainly you can. Large-scale public investment from the federal government to local firms and governments to experiment and find the best solutions, which then diffuse, expand, and then aggregate upward, would hopefully be how that issue plays out. I'm just going to keep pushing back with optimism.
And that's why we love you. I've got a two-part question from Rachel. How do you expect federalism and the balance of power between the federal government and states to change? And do you anticipate both the federal government and state governments expanding their scope?
Yes. Yeah, I think that's exactly right, because I think the key here is that people's demands from their federal and state governments have gone up. People now expect more of government and expect it to step in and address these issues. And with those expectations, I think, come sort of associated powers. So I think in many ways, the public thinks that has to happen. And the public opinion data reflects this. I think if you look at the public opinion data, people now sort of quite understandably are expecting more of their government, and that lasts and that changes things. And you might think, you might think that's a good thing. If people are paying attention more, if people are sort of increasing their information and knowledge, if people are engaging in more rational retrospective voting, we sort of better approximate the idealized norms of American democracy that, that we hold dear. If we increase engagement, if we increase care, concern, knowledge, participation, activism, that's generally only for the better, and that it increases representation.
That was an inspiring answer. And Nicole wants to know, is there a way to leverage the same political economic forces that have increased research and NIH funding to increase our public health infrastructure? Or is the history of fears of public health care too overpowering?
That's interesting. If I know who Nicole is, I will ask them this later. But right, so could there be a Susan G. Komen Foundation? Right? Could there be a National Alliance for Mental Illness for public health goods like ventilators and masks? I think it's plausible that a model, wow, you're really doing a lot of thinking out loud here. It's plausible a model could be, here's a plausible model. You take the sort of Komen, NAMI, like disease lobbying model, and you use the sort of energy and personal experience of like a Parkland type model. So coming out of the crisis, first responders, healthcare workers, essential workers, families affected by this could plausibly band together in an effective way to create that sort of mass mobilization for objects previously unrepresented in Congress, like masks and like ventilators. That would be really nice. Nicole, you can start that. That's your job, Nicole.
Rich wants to know if you think wealth inequality is actually the primary cause for the president's low approval, despite what have traditionally been very positive predictors, like a booming stock market and low unemployment.
Yeah, so it's a really good question. My view on why 5 months ago, the president's approval was below where historical economic indicators would predict is twofold. One, I think that there are a lot of people who are turned off by the president. And we can all think of reasons why that might be. I also think that both growing inequality and growing attentiveness to issues of inequality, sort of bring some component of those measures, make some component of those measures less predictive. So take the unemployment rate again. if labor force participation is not strong, the unemployment rate is is not as good of a measure of overall economic health. Using the stock market index is a great measure of economic health for those who are asset holders, but most Americans are not asset holders in large number. And so, and of course there are interactive effects, right? But I think it's both. I think there's a Trump effect, and I think there is sort of a secular stagnation, structural change in the economy, stagnant median income growth until very recently. And that those interact to change the nature of the measure with respect to Trump in two ways.
I think I have a question that will allow you to fly your optimist flag again, but how do you see the engagement of citizens at the local, state, and federal level as contributing to or hindering an effective crisis response?
I think that the fact that so many of I think the fact that sort of broad swaths of American society are increasingly affected by this. Regionally, this is something that began in large coastal elite cities and has now moved to the rural inland, right? If we think about the distribution of people in any given hospital who are essential frontline workers who are engaged with these issues, it runs the gamut across, race, class, gender, religion, like whatever. And so I think that what that yields is broad-based personal experience with components of the crisis, and in turn, broad-based demands on government for sufficient responses. And I think that those broad-based experiences and broad-based demand on government will continue as the crisis is not going away. That is only going to continue. Yeah.
Professor Nachlis, I think this is our last question. Do you, and I don't know if you've had a chance to ask your students this, but Huntley would like to know, do your students like the idea that our federal and state governments will be growing?
I don't poll my students on their partisanship. I have to say, I think what the students want is less growth than like growth is sort of orthogonal to what they want. I think what they want is competence and expertise, right? The reason why they're studying public policy and government is so that they know the right thing to do when they're in the positions to make the decisions. And so, if growth comes along with an expansion of expertise, an expansion of capacity, an expansion of sort of expert administration in the Woodrow Wilson sense, I think they'd be thrilled. If a smaller government does that, they'd be equally thrilled. I think what I find that they're deeply invested in is sort of like common sense, collaborative, evidence-based, sensible solutions that address the problems. And so, if growth is one medium-term mechanism for that, then I think they'd like that. And I think, if it turns out that growth is not a good mechanism for that, then they'd like it less. But they're really looking for sort of competence, results, and expertise. And so, my hope is that, once they leave Hanover or virtual Hanover, they will contribute to the provision of those public goods. So yeah, I think I'll end on that optimistic note. And I will thank everyone for these super provocative questions that I'm going to keep thinking about quite a bit, and throw things back to Sadhna.
Well, thank you, Herschel. This has been such an interesting talk. And along with technical competence, I hope we also focus on really good managerial and leadership skills as well. And that's something that certainly the Rockefeller Center really strives and works very hard to do. So next week is our last of the series of Rocky Watch. And we are so pleased that Daniel Benjamin from the Dickey Center for International Understanding will be joining us. So join us Wednesday, June 3rd from 5 to 5:45. We look forward to seeing you then.